My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I never thought that a Tuesday morning in November would change everything. The Seattle rain was tapping against my apartment window like an impatient visitor, and I was wrapped in my favorite blanket, nursing a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. I'd been battling the flu for 3 days, my voice barely a whisper, my body aching in ways I didn't know were possible. My phone buzzed on the coffee table. The caller ID showed Rebecca Chen, conference director. My heart skipped. Rebecca was organizing the annual Pacific Northwest Education Summit, the biggest educational conference on the West Coast. I'd submitted a proposal months ago about innovative teaching methods in underserved communities, but honestly, I'd forgotten about it completely. Sarah? Rebecca's voice crackled through the speaker. I have incredible news. Your proposal was selected as our keynote presentation. But here's the thing. Our original keynote speaker just canceled due to a family emergency. We need you to present tomorrow morning. I nearly dropped the phone. Tomorrow? Rebecca, I can barely speak. I'm sick as a dog. I know this is last minute, but Sarah, your work with those kids in South Seattle has been extraordinary. The committee unanimously chose your proposal. We have over 800 educators flying in from across the country. You'd be addressing principals, superintendents, policymakers, people who can actually implement your methods nationwide. The weight of the opportunity hit me like a freight train. For 5 years, I'd been teaching in Lincoln Elementary, a school where most kids qualified for free lunch, where resources were stretched thinner than tissue paper, where I developed unconventional methods that actually worked. Kids who'd been written off were suddenly excelling, but nobody outside our little community knew about it. The presentation is at 9 a.m. sharp, Rebecca continued. The theme is Revolutionary Education, Breaking Barriers, Building Futures. Your story fits perfectly. I looked around my messy apartment, tissues scattered everywhere, empty soup cans on the counter. My reflection in the black TV screen showed a woman who looked like she'd been hit by a truck. But behind the exhaustion, something else flickered. Determination. How long do I have to speak? I croaked. 45 minutes, plus Q&A. Sarah, this could change everything for you. For your methods. For those kids. After Rebecca hung up, I sat in the silence of my apartment, listening to the rain and the distant hum of Seattle traffic. Part of me wanted to call back and decline. I felt terrible, looked worse, and had less than 24 hours to prepare the most important presentation of my career. But then I thought about Marcus, a third grader who'd been labeled learning disabled, until I discovered he was actually brilliant. He just learned differently. I thought about Aaliyah, who went from barely reading to devouring entire novels after we implemented reading circles that felt more like storytelling sessions. I thought about the skeptical looks from other teachers when I first proposed turning math lessons into real-world problem-solving adventures. Those kids deserve to have their story told. They deserve to have educators across the country know that there was another way, a better way. I grabbed my laptop and started typing. By 8 p.m., my apartment looked like a paper hurricane had torn through it. Research articles, student work samples, photographs, and sticky notes covered every surface. My voice was still raspy, but adrenaline was keeping me upright. I called my best friend, David, a graphic designer who'd helped me with school projects before. Sarah, you sound terrible. Shouldn't you be in bed? David, I need your help. I have to give the most important presentation of my life tomorrow morning, and I need slides that will blow people's minds. Tomorrow morning? Are you insane? You can barely talk. I explained the situation while David listened with growing excitement. Despite his initial protests, I could hear him already firing up his computer. Okay, send me everything you have. We're pulling an all-nighter. For the next 6 hours, we worked like a well-oiled machine. David would create stunning visuals while I wrote and rewrote my speech, testing different approaches, timing each section. We video called every hour to sync up, his apartment in Portland just as chaotic as mine. Look at this data, I said during our 2 a.m. check-in, holding up charts showing my students' progress. When I started using project-based learning tied to their actual lives, reading scores jumped 40% in 1 semester. That's incredible, Sarah. But how do you explain it without sounding like you're attacking traditional methods? That was the challenge. My methods worked, but they required teachers to throw out the playbook and start fresh. How do you tell 800 seasoned educators that they need to completely reimagine their approach without making them defensive? I tell them the truth, I realized. I tell them about the failures first. about how traditional methods failed these kids, how I failed these kids, until I stopped trying to fit them into the system and started fitting the system to them. David was quiet for a moment. That's your hook. Start with vulnerability. Show them you're not preaching from an ivory tower. By 5 a.m., we had something beautiful. The presentation told the story chronologically. My first year teaching, the wake-up calls, the experimental methods, the resistance from administration, the breakthrough moments, and finally, the incredible results. But I still felt like death warmed over. "Sarah, maybe you should call in sick," David said gently during our final call. "You've pushed yourself too hard." I looked at my reflection in the bathroom mirror. Dark circles under my eyes, skin pale as parchment, hair that looked like I'd stuck my finger in an electrical socket. But my eyes had a fire in them that hadn't been there in months. "David, what if this is my only shot? What if I never get another chance to share what we've learned? Then you go out there and give them everything you've got." I spent the last hour before leaving practicing in front of my mirror, my voice growing stronger with each run-through. The rain had stopped, and the first hints of dawn were creeping through my window. As I gathered my materials, I found a handwritten note that had fallen behind my desk. It was from Marcus, my former student who'd struggled so much. "Ms. Mitchell, thank you for seeing me when nobody else did. You changed my life." That note went into my pocket. It was going with me to the stage. The Washington State Convention Center was buzzing with activity when I arrived at 7:30 a.m. Educators from across the Pacific Northwest filled the lobby, their conversations creating a symphony of passionate voices discussing everything from budget cuts to innovative curriculum. I checked in at the registration desk, where a volunteer handed me a speaker badge and a program. There it was, printed in bold letters, 9 a.m., Keynote, Revolutionary Education, From Failure to Innovation, Sarah Mitchell, Lincoln Elementary. My stomach did a backflip. "Ms. Mitchell?" A young man with a headset appeared beside me. "I'm Jake, the AV coordinator. Ready for a sound check?" The main auditorium was massive. 800 seats arranged in sweeping arcs, all facing a stage that suddenly seemed enormous. The lights were bright, the microphone looked intimidating, and the large screens on either side of the stage displayed my title slide. "How's your voice feeling?" Jake asked as he adjusted my lapel mic. "Like I've been gargling gravel," I admitted. "But it's getting stronger." "Nerves or sickness?" "Both," he smiled. "I've been doing this for 15 years. The best speakers are always the most nervous. It means you care." As I ran through a few test slides with Jake, early arrivals began filtering into the auditorium. I could see them taking their seats, checking their phones, chatting with colleagues. These weren't just teachers. I spotted superintendent badges, university professors, policymakers, and educational consultants. Rebecca appeared backstage, her energy infectious despite the early hour. "Sarah, you look tired, but determined. How are you feeling?" "Terrified and excited in equal measure." "Perfect. That's exactly how you should feel." She handed me a bottle of water with honey and lemon. "For your voice. The audience is incredible. We have representatives from 12 states, 3 Canadian provinces, and even a delegation from Finland studying American educational innovation." Finland, the country with the world's best education system, was sending people to learn from American teachers. The irony wasn't lost on me. At 8:45, Rebecca gave me the 5-minute warning. I stood in the wings, watching the last few attendees find their seats. The auditorium was completely full, with people standing along the walls. I closed my eyes and thought about my students. Not the data or the test scores, but their faces. Maria, who'd been convinced she was bad at math until we started using cooking to teach fractions. James, who'd never spoken in class until we created a classroom newspaper and discovered he was a natural journalist. Destiny, who'd gone from failing reading to writing her own stories after we started our peer mentoring program. "Ladies and gentlemen," Rebecca's voice filled the auditorium, "please welcome our keynote speaker, Sarah Mitchell." The applause was polite but enthusiastic. I walked onto the stage, my legs surprisingly steady, and looked out at 800 faces looking back at me expectantly. I reached the podium, adjusted the microphone, and took a breath. "Good morning. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I'm going to start with a confession." My voice was stronger than I'd expected. 5 years ago, I was a terrible teacher. A ripple of surprised laughter ran through the audience. I had their attention. I mean it. I was failing my students every single day, and I didn't even know it. The next 45 minutes flew by like 5 minutes. I told them about my first year at Lincoln Elementary, how I'd tried to implement every best practice I'd learned in graduate school, only to watch my students disengage more each day. I shared my lowest moment, the day I found myself crying in the supply closet because nothing I was doing seemed to matter. That's when I realized, I continued, my voice now strong and clear. I wasn't teaching children. I was teaching a curriculum to bodies that happened to contain children. I showed them the before and after data, but more importantly, I showed them the students. Photos of kids engaged in learning that looked nothing like traditional classroom instruction. Videos of student presentations where third graders explained complex concepts to visiting high schoolers. Work samples that demonstrated deep understanding through creative expression. When we started treating our classroom like a real community with real problems to solve, everything changed, I explained. Math wasn't about worksheets anymore. It was about calculating how much food we needed for our classroom garden to feed 3 homeless shelters for a month. The audience was leaning forward, many taking notes frantically. I could see nods of recognition, faces lighting up with understanding. Reading wasn't about comprehension worksheets. It was about researching solutions to problems our community partners brought to us. Writing wasn't about 5-paragraph essays. It was about communicating our solutions to city council members and business leaders. I shared the challenges too, the resistance from administration, the difficulty convincing parents that their children were actually learning despite the unconventional methods, the extra hours required to redesign everything from scratch. But here's what happened, I said, advancing to my final data slide. In 3 years, our students went from ranking in the bottom 10th percentile of the district to the top 15th percentile. More importantly, they went from disliking school to asking if they could stay after hours to keep working on their projects. The Q&A session was electric. Principals wanted to know how to support teachers making this transition. Teachers asked about specific implementation strategies. Policymakers inquired about scalability and assessment methods. One question came from a superintendent in rural Montana. Ms. Mitchell, this sounds incredible. But how do we convince skeptical teachers and parents that this isn't just a feel-good experiment? I smiled. You let the results speak for themselves, and you remember that every child deserves to experience the joy of learning, not just the burden of being educated. As I wrapped up my final answer, something unexpected happened. One person in the front row stood up and began clapping, then another, then an entire section. Within seconds, the entire auditorium was on their feet, applauding not just politely, but enthusiastically. I stood there, stunned. This morning, I'd been sick in bed, convinced I should cancel. Now, 800 educators were giving me a standing ovation for sharing the story of what happened when we stopped trying to fix kids and started fixing the system. As the applause continued, I thought about that note from Marcus in my pocket. I thought about all my students who deserved to have their story heard. I thought about the teachers in this audience who would go back to their schools and try something different, something better. Rebecca appeared beside me on stage. Ladies and gentlemen, Sarah Mitchell. The applause grew even louder. Later, as I packed up my materials, dozens of educators approached me. Business cards were exchanged, implementation partnerships discussed, follow-up presentations requested. A publisher wanted to discuss a book deal. A documentary filmmaker asked about following my classroom for a year. But the moment that mattered most came from a young teacher from rural Oregon. Ms. Mitchell, she said, her eyes bright with possibility. I've been teaching for 2 years, and I've been feeling like a failure. After hearing you today, I realize I'm not failing. I'm just teaching the wrong way. Thank you for showing me that there's another path. As I walked out of the convention center into the clear Seattle afternoon, my phone buzzed with a text from David. Saw the live stream. You killed it. How are you feeling? I looked back at the building where 800 people had just heard the story of how education could be different, could be better, could actually serve the children it claimed to help. Like I'm finally teaching, I texted back. The rain had stopped completely, and for the first time in days, I could breathe clearly. Tomorrow, I'd go back to my classroom at Lincoln Elementary, back to my students who were counting on me to keep innovating, keep fighting for them, keep proving that every child has unlimited potential if we just have the courage to see it. But today, I'd done something I'd never thought possible. I'd shared their story with the world, and the world had listened.